Alright folks, it's me again, it's the Tank Commander, and if you're seeing this, it is very special today, because guess what? We are down to just 5 days away from me going on my cruise. And my god, I have to say, my holy smokes, it was a windstorm last night. At least 3 trees broke, and, well, technically, one of them snapped its limb, one of them snapped its trunk, and one all came down behind our house. My dad says it's good firewood. And I gotta say, it's incredible how the weather is just changing here. Like, it's going from, like, hot to cold to rain to snow. It's absolutely incredible. And also kind of annoying, really. Especially with my ears, as I've said, with my ear surgery. But hey, guess what? We gotta get going on with the next part of the series. Welcome back to the most useless, pathetic, and obsolete tanks of World War II. And guess what? RJ Nagel 2000, if you're listening, we just got a whole new record this time. Because our next tank got 3 votes last night. And one of them was from one of my friends in London who voted to me on Facebook Messenger, believe it or not. And strangely enough, the comments don't seem to be showing up on my videos. Maybe it's because they are potentially being done, like, right after. I don't know. But hopefully, with the cruise vlog, everybody will be able to watch and see the comments. But without further ado, let's see the tank that we are doing today. This day's winner, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is the tank for today. What is this tank? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the world-renowned French Renault FT-17, the FT-17. It was produced by Renault for the First World War. Now you're probably thinking, how is it that this tank got into the Second World War? Well, a little backstory of it. And I actually brought out an information sheet because the information of this thing is incredible. This is a French light tank that was produced in 1917 to start off. And it was a light tank. It weighed only 6.5 tons. It had a crew of 2, 1 driver and 1 the commander, who also had to be the gunner and loader. As you can probably see, because it's a very small size. And most tanks in World War II had 5 crew members. So this tank first saw action in March of 1918 at the Third Battle of the Aisne, or in French, La Troisième Bataille de l'Aisne. Now this was a part of the German Spring Offensive in 1918, which also included the Second Battle of Cambrai. And this tank was first used en masse with about 30 of them, and it scared the living hell out of the Germans because this was a light tank. And the Germans had already, for 2 years, had to deal with the British heavy tanks like the Mark I through the Mark V. And this was a part of a program that the French had. The French wanted to have 2 types of tanks. One was la char de cavalerie, which was what was known as a cavalry tank, and what was also le char d'assaut, which was an assault tank. This was basically a cavalry tank, which was a tank to support the infantry. And the larger tanks, which I'm pulling up here, there was the CA-1 Schneider, okay, and it was armed with a couple of Hotchkiss machine guns and a 75mm, what was known as a Blockhaus Schneider gun. And the second one, pulling up now, this is the Char d'Assaut Saint-Chamond, okay, obviously named after the city that it was built in. This was an even heavier assault tank, which had a few Hotchkiss machine guns, and had a 75mm French 1897 gun. Everyone knows the famed French 75. Now, these tanks were not necessarily as successful as the FT-17. This was able to be produced in mass numbers. So, now, this is reading from this information sheet. The engine of this thing is such a big, such a long name, and it is a Renault 4-cylinder, 4.5-liter thermosiphon water-cooled gasoline pump engine with Zenith preset carburetor and magneto ignition. Talk about a mouthful. And this engine produced a total of 39 horsepower and gave it a top speed of 4.8 miles an hour or 7.7 kilometers an hour. Now, of course, for the time, it's not a fast speed. It's like a little bit more than a human running speed, or jogging, I guess you could say. But for the time, with trench warfare, the only place you could really go was forwards, and really nowhere else. And this thing had a armor thickness on the hull of 16 millimeters all around, and it had 22 millimeters of armor on the turret. This was specifically designed to hold off only support fire, meaning from machine guns and rifles. And again, I'm not sure if I said this, but the German famed Tankgewehr, the first anti-tank rifle, you have to remember, the same armor that was on the Mark IV tanks, you had to hit these tanks flat on in order for that round to penetrate. But I think that the turret, there's no way the turret would be able to be penetrated because this was 22 millimeters of armor on it. And it had a primary armament of a 18 caliber pistol SA-18 cannon, or the second one was an 8mm Hotchkiss MLE 1914 medium machine gun. So now you're probably thinking, well, wouldn't that be just a secondary armament? No, because this was a one-man turreted light tank. If you look at pictures of it, as I'll pull up right here, this tank is incredibly small, okay? And if you look at, if anybody who plays World of Tanks knows, you pull up Armor Inspector, this is the French Tier 1 light tank. And it only has 2 crew members. There's not a lot of space in this tank. But, believe it or not, this tank, with its action, was so sought after the First World War. There were many models named after it that were bought by so many other countries. The Americans had the Ford M1917, right here. The French also came up with another tank that was also produced by Czechoslovakia, which was the NC-1. Another version of this, which was sold to Poland, was the NC-2, but this thing had special tracks, so it was known as the NC-2 Kegresahanstan. The Japanese also bought it. It was came to be known as the NC-27, or the Renault Utsu. The Chinese bought a model, and that one became known as the NC-31. The Russians also bought the tank and called it the Ruski Reno, and they later put up a derivative tank known as the MS-1, originally the T-18. And believe it or not, the French also came up with some other ideas. One idea was this one, the FT-75BS. Now, BS stands for Blockhaus Schneider, which was supposed to be a light self-propelled gun. And also, they had later models which were modified with machine guns. One was known as the FT Modifié 31, which was the modified 31. And there was also the famous design known as the FTEC, which was what was known as anti-char, which was a design to produce a tank destroyer, which either had the 25mm anti-tank rifle or the 47mm anti-tank gun, which is now the French Tier 2 tank destroyer in World of Tanks, but not in World of Tanks Blitz anymore. And this is incredible. So you think about it, so if this tank was so great, why was it that it was in the Second World War? Well, as you know, the tank was bought by basically every country looking to get a cheap tank, and these were cheap. But the issue was, this tank was already 20 years old, was already over 20 years old when the Second World War began. And the problem was, this tank just still had a very crap gun. Now, allow me to explain that. what I have here is the round that the tank used. Okay? This right here is the 37mm shell that would have been fired from the French gun. It's very small, and this is about the size of the warhead. It's about 2 to 3 inches long. Now this one is deactivated, so you can see there's nothing in there. But it was not meant for armor penetration capacity. As we look in comparison, this is an American 37mm round, in case anybody has remembered seeing from my cruise vlog last year. Look at the comparison. Look at that. The round itself is bigger than the cartridge for this round. So you look at the comparison between the two, that's vastly superior armor penetrating power. And when the Germans invaded France, okay, the FT-17 was one of those tanks that saw use, but it had to come into action against this. This is the Panzer III Ausführung E, the Panzer III-E, which had a 75mm KWK on it. Did I say 75mm? I meant 37mm. And this thing had vastly superior armor penetrating power. Now you have to understand, the hull armor of the Panzer III was 30mm thick. This gun could not go through that. It could potentially go through the turret because it didn't have a gun mantlet, and I think the turret's armor was about 20mm thick or something. But that was like at suicidally close range, and this thing could knock out an FT-17 from just about 500 meters. That's a long ways away. Other tanks that it had to face were such as the Czech LT-38 or the Panzer 38T. This thing still had a good penetrating 37mm gun and could still knock this tank out, and it also had 37mm of armor on it. Even the slightly worse LT-35, that thing still had a better armor penetrating capability than the FT-17. You think about that, that's pretty upsetting. But surprisingly, the FT still lived on after the invasion. The Vichy French forces used it. I think in Tunisia they actually used it a little bit, and Morocco when the Americans invaded. But you think about an FT-17, which is a 6.5-ton tank, going against an M5 Stuart, I know this is an M3, weighing 16 tons. This stumpy little 37mm SA-18 going up against an American M6 37mm gun on a tank that also has 30mm of armor, but sloped, which is even worse. That shows you, that's quite sad. Believe it or not, some of these tanks that also had the machine gun were also used by the Luftwaffe in an anti-aircraft role. Now this is where I think that kind of got a little bit, I'm going to say, stupid. Because a tank that has a manually operated turret with one man on it, and a machine gun that doesn't necessarily have a lot of elevation, trying to use that as an anti-aircraft tank, that's going a little bit far. But believe it or not, still, this tank even saw service in the siege of Paris. Now remember, with Paris, the German commander surrendered, and there was only street fighting. But you think about it, a tank like this, a two-man light tank, going up against an M4 Sherman, 5 crew members, 60mm of armor on the front, and a 75mm cannon. That's suicide. Absolutely suicide. You think about that. That's a one-way, as they would say in World of Tanks, that's a one-way ticket to the garage. And of course, that's by famous World of Tanks speechman Luke Neller. They would say, his ticket was punched to the garage. Now, you think about that, the FT-17. And even after that, I'm pulling this up. This is the early 2000s. This is Afghanistan, okay? Believe it or not, the Germans and the Ottomans who had a presence in the Middle East in World War I took Renault FT-17s down to Arabia and had those tanks situated there. And they eventually made their way over to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This tank was technically still in use in places like Iraq and Afghanistan in the 1990s. Now, I know that's disputed, but they were recovered there. They found tons of World War II vehicles there. This tank basically was like a forever tank, and now it's used in movies and stuff, and there are actually some that are preserved and well enough to still be fully operational. However, you have to understand, the problem with this tank was, as revolutionary as it was because it was the first tank to have a 360-degree rotating turret, it just was, that's what I'm saying, it was hopelessly obsolete by the time it got to the Second World War. Because any anti-tank weapon was going to penetrate. And you think about it later on in the war, as I'll show you again, it was bad enough with this round going up against 37mm rounds, but when it came to places like North Africa, you had it going against 6-pounder anti-tank guns armed with that were 57mm, and you look at the size of that. And if any of you know, like, just imagine going up against something that had a short 75mm howitzer. You remember this, Honest Gaming. I showed you this. That's what's incredible. Trying to put a tank against that, against even a 75mm howitzer, a howitzer by then is going to wreck thin armor. As everybody knows, thin armor reacts catastrophically when being struck by a high explosive shell from a howitzer. That's the crazy thing. But even though, it still astonishes me how this tank managed to see so much action with so many countries ever since it was introduced. I will not say it was pathetic, absolutely not. Showing that it was able to survive so long like that, that's an accomplishment. It was not useless. There were many uses, even some going as far as turning that into like an artillery tractor. The only thing was, it was just obsolete by the time it got to the Second World War. Basically, it was a last-ditch tank for any of those who were on the defensive. But, you know something? It's still an incredible tank. And ladies and gentlemen, this ends it for today. So remember, get out there and vote, and I hope I'll see you guys tomorrow, because we have just 5 tanks left for the next 4 days. So make sure you get out there and vote, folks. It'll be in the description box for you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the next part of the pre-cruise vlog, signing off with me, the Tank Commander, and I hope you enjoyed. See you guys tomorrow.